Hey guys, welcome to another U.S. history lesson with Lennox, and today we're talking about President number 3. That's right, we're talking about Thomas Jefferson. Now, before he became president, we go way back with Jefferson in U.S. history. Remember, this is the guy that wrote the Declaration of Independence. He also served as Secretary of State under George Washington, as well as the Vice President under John Adams. Well, now it's his time to be the big kahuna. It's time for Thomas Jefferson's presidency. But before we get started with that, one question. Where's Alexander Hamilton? If you remember correctly, during the Revolutionary War and Washington's presidency, it seemed like Hamilton was on the fast track into a career of presidential politics. I mean, really, people expected him to run for president, but he never did. So what happened? Well, bottom line, he got in a little bit of hot water. See, Hamilton, during Washington's presidency, found himself involved in a little bit of a, well, I don't want to say affair of the heart, because it wasn't of the heart. I mean, it just was kind of a trashy affair with a married woman. Maria Reynolds became the object of his passion. And when he got caught in this affair by her husband, basically the husband offered him a way out. He said, if you keep paying me, you can keep seeing my wife. And so Hamilton paid him and kept the affair going. Well, over time, word got out that he was having this affair, that he was making payments to Maria Reynolds' husband. The problem was a lot of people thought that he was using government funds to make those payments. So Hamilton's going to be approached and accused of misusing government funds, which is, that's jail time, baby. Well, Hamilton said, oh, no. There's one thing I know, it's how to keep good records. And when he was accused of this crime of embezzling American funds, he produced records showing that he was indeed paying Reynolds, but he was paying them with his own money. But here's the problem. Now people know about the affair. And Hamilton wants to protect his reputation, which is very interesting because the way he chose to protect his reputation was to write down all the sordid details of his relationship with Maria Reynolds and publish it. We know it today as the Reynolds pamphlet, but Hamilton called it Observations on Certain Documents Contained in Number 5 and 6 of the History of the United States for the year 1796, in which the charge of speculation against Alexander Hamilton, late Secretary of the Treasury, is fully refuted. You see, it had actually been written about in this book, The History of the United States for the year 1796. And so Hamilton wanted to basically cut it off at the pass and say, hey, listen, I'm going to prove my innocence. And he literally wrote something like an 80 or 90-page pamphlet laying out this affair, everything that happened, every payment that he made, he shared letters that went back and forth between him and this woman. What's fascinating was he ended up outing himself in an attempt to protect his reputation as a government official. He really just trashed his reputation as a guy. And quite honestly, this is where his wife kind of heard about it. Well, that's how the story goes, but either way, would you want to be Elijah Hamilton and have your husband go out in public and share this kind of information? So long story short, that's where Hamilton is. He's on the outs politically. So he's going to make a comeback a little bit during the Jefferson election, but we'll get to that in just a minute. The election of 1800 is often known as the Second American Revolution, and the reason is simple. It's the first time in our history that power is going to be transferred from one political ideology to another without a single shot being fired. That's the great thing about our country, is we can change political ideologies as far as leadership goes without any form of revolution or any form of rebellion. We just do it with elections. Well, in 1800, we're going to shift from a Federalist perspective of governing to a Democratic Republican perspective. The election was interesting because we had 4 different candidates running. For the Democratic Republicans, we had Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. For representing the Federalists, we had Thomas Pinckney and sitting president John Adams. The primary issues that are going to be addressed during the election of 1800 has a lot to do with our relationship to the rest of the world and this war that's going on over in Europe between France and England. Now, the Alien and Sedition Acts, I think, is number one at the top of the list of what's going to be debated during this time. And a lot of that had to do with Adams and the methods he used to protect American security during that war. You also had the increase of British interference with our trade, the impressment of our sailors and such. Because of all that going on, and because of the quasi-war between the United States and France, that was that undeclared naval war between us and France, we see a growing debt in our nation. And a lot of that has to do with military expenditures. So these are the topics that lead us into the election of 1800. These are the main issues that are being debated. When it came time for the election, you got to understand in 1800, there was no popular vote at this point. Presidents were chosen by state legislatures. The state legislatures would often choose who their candidate was going to be, and then they would send their electors to Philadelphia for the Electoral College convention. If we ever get to a situation, and it's still this way today, where we don't have a president or a candidate that gets the majority of the votes, the House of Representatives chooses who the next president was going to be. This is what happens in 1800. You have two candidates who are tied at the top, Jefferson and Burr, each with 73 electoral votes, but neither one has the majority. So, according to the U.S. Constitution, specifically Article 2, Section 1, if there be more than one who have an equal number of votes, the House of Representatives shall immediately choose by ballot one of them for president. That word immediately is very important because we're not waiting for the next House of Representatives to come in. We're waiting for the current one. And in 1800, the current House of Representatives was controlled by Federalists. So basically, you have a Federalist-controlled House of Representatives determining who is going to be the Democratic Republican president. It's either going to be Jefferson or Aaron Burr. You can kind of see a little bit of flip in voting between when Adams got elected in 1796 and when Jefferson got elected, or will get elected in 1800. You can see that Ohio, flipped a little bit more votes went to the Federalists, but New York, a big state with a lot of electors, is going to come towards the Democratic Republicans. That's why we didn't have a clear-cut winner here. So it gets down to Jefferson and Burr. Adams, Pinckney, out. They just take the top two. And that's why the House had such a difficult decision to make. It's kind of like choosing the lesser of two evils. We got to choose a Democratic Republican. We don't want to, but we got to. Now, Jefferson is going to try to appeal to those Federalists who are in the House of Representatives. He is promising that some of the government-appointed positions, specifically the presidential-appointed positions that are held by Federalists at this point, he's going to allow them to keep their positions. It's still going to be a tough row to hoe, though, for Jefferson. It takes 36 ballots before he is finally chosen as the winner of this election. He will become president. Aaron Burr, by rule, will become the vice president. This whole thing with a tie and, two guys, the winner getting the presidency and the loser getting the vice presidency, Jefferson fell victim to that in the election of 1796 when he had to become the vice president to Adams. That's going to be addressed right away in 1800 with the passage of the 12th Amendment. The 12th Amendment basically states now that a president and a vice president have to run on separate ballots. So whoever's running for president, that's the only office they get. Whoever's running for vice president, that's the only office they get. And it's because of the 12th Amendment that we're later going to see presidential candidates kind of choose a running mate, the guy they want as vice president if elected. I told you it took 36 votes to get Jefferson in. Well, what finally led to him being elected, and this wasn't the only influence, but this was a big one, was Alexander Hamilton, his nemesis from the Washington administration. Remember how much they fought? Well, Hamilton, though he was cast out of politics, still had influence. He was still seen as a leading Federalist. So he is going to be approached by Federalists in the House saying, man, if you were here, who would you vote for? And Hamilton said, I would vote for Jefferson. Bottom line, he said Jefferson has some pretensions to character, but Mr. Burr is the most unprincipled man in the United States. Check this out. Bankrupt beyond redemption. How can you possibly get over that? Basically, Alexander Hamilton knew that Jefferson, though he disagreed with nearly everything he said, was a man of his word. And if Jefferson said, I'm going to do it, it's going to get done. And that's what Alexander Hamilton respected. He said, Burr is not like that. Burr was what we call a yes man. He would say yes to anybody if it would get him ahead. I mean, he switched parties several times throughout his career. So that's why Hamilton backed Jefferson. Jefferson comes in and he has a tough challenge ahead of him because the country is split. Remember, this is the first time we've chosen someone of a different party to be the president. It's commonplace today. But Jefferson had to give a speech in his first inaugural that would help bring the Federalists and the Republicans together. And so there's one famous line that I think has multiple meanings in the first inaugural address. It's when Jefferson said, we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. When he said we are all Republicans, he's talking about republic, the value of republicanism. And we are a constitutional republic governed by representatives. Now, we have differences on how many representatives each state should have, but we believe that this system works. He also says we're all Federalists, and he's referring to the concept of federalism, that we should divide power between states and a central government. Again, the difference is by the degree of who has more power. Obviously, the Democratic Republicans believe that the state should have more power. Saying, bottom line, we still have the same political values. We just differ in what degree those values should go, but they're still the same in both of us. He also said we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists when looking at domestic and foreign policy. With regards to domestic policy, he said we all believe in a wise and frugal government that is in place to restrain people from hurting each other. But they also are in place to kind of stay out of our way, to allow us to pursue our own forms of industry and our own opportunity to improve. But then with foreign policy, he believed that we all thought that the government should maintain peace as well as commerce with other countries, but staying out of their problems. This is a throwback to Washington's farewell address, where his one warning was to stay out of entangling alliances with foreign governments. So this is Jefferson reaching out to the Federalists saying, yes, we believe we need to stay out of foreign entanglements. But he also reaches out to the Republicans saying, we believe that the central government is in place to protect us, but to leave us as much alone as they possibly can. So once he's in office, and he's given that inaugural address, it's time for Jefferson to get to work. And his presidency is kind of a tale of two cities. One really nice one, one really bad one. And his first term is fantastic because his first term is highlighted by the Louisiana Purchase. Greatest real estate deal in history. Now remember, Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans believed in basing our economy on an agrarian system. Farmers, agriculture. So the idea of increasing our land was huge in Jefferson's mind. In fact, he passed a lot of legislation his first term with the intent of increasing the size of our country. The Harrison Land Law in 1800 offered 320 acres of government land for purchase with a down payment of just 1/4 of the value. This is going to open land up to a lot of people who otherwise couldn't afford it. The Act of 1804 is going to reduce the minimum purchase to 160 acres. That's going to help people moving out west. And then the Act of 1820, now this is beyond Jefferson's presidency, but it's going to reduce this down to 80 acres available, and you could buy that land for $1.25 an acre. The only thing is there's no credit. You have to pay cash up front. This liberal land acts that he does, especially the Liberal Land Act of 1800, that's going to bring in a lot more states. Specifically, Ohio's. There is going to be some problems, some controversy with some of this. There's going to be some state legislatures who see an opportunity to make money. In Georgia, there were some legislators who were bribed, and they started selling land below its value to companies, and then they would get a kickback from that. When that was found out, the legislature at the time is actually going to void those sales. But these type of deals start occurring because it was so easy and there was so much land to sell. The companies are going to, when their sale is voided, those 4 companies are going to sue the state of Georgia in federal court. Georgia is going to surrender the land kind of as punishment to the United States. Those 4 companies will be compensated for their loss. The problem is you're going to have some states' rights Republicans in Georgia. We call them quids. They refuse to vote for the payment to those companies. And that's going to cause some problems moving forward. In fact, it's going to take it all the way to the Supreme Court. One significant fallout of what was called the YAZOO land claim was Fletcher versus Peck, where the federal government, the Supreme Court, said that rescinding that law was unconstitutional and was an infringement on the legal contract that the legislature had with those companies. This is actually going to slow down the settlement of Georgia and also Alabama and Mississippi. Because if you go back and look at this map, this is the land we're talking about right here. And this land will later become part of Alabama and Mississippi. But it was a big mess because these legislatures found, saw a way where they could make an easy dollar to do this. Okay? But let's get back to the Louisiana Purchase. Louisiana Purchase, like I said, the biggest real estate deal in American history. But the question was it constitutional? Like I said, Jefferson's all about expanding the territory of our country. But you have to understand why he did the purchase the way he did. There was land that was disputed between us and basically France. Now, if you look back, go back to the Treaty of 1763. So the Treaty of Paris of 1763. If you remember correctly, all this land over here that belonged to France is going to go to England under the guidelines of the treaty. France had also controlled Louisiana. Now, in controlling Louisiana, they were worried, coming to the end of the French-Indian War, that England would get all of this. So they are going to cede or give away the land of the Louisiana Territory to Spain, giving them control. The idea is Spain would hold it until France could come and take it back. Well, the Treaty of 1783, Treaty of Paris 1783, ending the American Revolution, is going to give the United States all this land. And this land borders up right here on the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River is vital to trade for our Western farmers who live in the Kentucky, Tennessee area, those places. Once you traverse the Mississippi River, you have to go through New Orleans, right here, this star, to get to the Gulf of Mexico. Think back to Washington's presidency and Pinckney's treaty. This was a treaty that we set up with Spain, that they gave us right of deposit and use of the New Orleans port, which was vital to our trade. Here comes Napoleon. Napoleon's going to come in and, he wants to conquer the world. He's working his way over in Europe, and he starts to look over at the Americas too. And he remembers this land that was given to Spain, the Louisiana Territory. He demands it back from Spain, saying, give it back to me or I'm just going to raid your country too. He gets the Louisiana Territory back, which means he gets control of New Orleans. We need that. So in 1803, Thomas Jefferson is going to send James Monroe and others to France to try to negotiate access to New Orleans. In fact, he offers Napoleon $10 million for New Orleans. Well, it just so happened that Napoleon was kind of short on money at the time, and he and his government officials said, "Man, we got a better deal for you. Instead of $10 million for New Orleans, why don't you give us $15 million and we'll give you all of Louisiana." Monroe and them couldn't say no to that, so that's what they did, and that's how we got the Louisiana Territory. But here's the problem. Did Monroe have the authority to make that purchase? The House of Representatives had approved the $10 million offer, but there was no approval for a $15 million offer. And as Monroe was acting on behalf of Thomas Jefferson, the question becomes, does the president have the right to make these kind of deals without the approval of Congress? If you look at Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, it says, the president shall have the power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of senators present concur. There ain't any senators there. He doesn't have the advice or to do this. He just does it on his own. Remember, Jefferson is a strict constructionist of the U.S. Constitution. He believes what it says, it says. There's no gray area. He's kind of operating in the gray area. So the question becomes, where in the Constitution is the power delegated to the president to add land to the United States? And to what extent did Jefferson basically compromise his principles? These same principles when he argued with Alexander Hamilton about the Bank of the United States. If it's not in the Constitution, you don't have the authority. Well, in this case, it's not in the Constitution. Jefferson did not have the authority. But, come on, 3 cents an acre? You can't beat that deal. And he has a Democratic-Republican Congress. They're going to vote, basically that he had the authority to do that. He's never questioned about it. Alexander Hamilton, though, is going to rip him apart in the newspaper, saying, hey, where's the strict constructionalist now? Didn't matter. We had the land. And that's going to lead to the Lewis and Clark expedition. The Lewis and Clark expedition is going to search for a northwest passage from the Mississippi River to the Pacific, basically a water route. They're going to travel through the Louisiana Territory as well as into the Oregon Territory, led by Sacagawea, her husband, and I guess her infant. She had a baby. I don't know if the baby played a big role in guiding Lewis and Clark, but he was there. Anyway, this was the big success of the Jefferson presidency, his first term. Now, Lewis and Clark, they're going to go on this trip and they're going to bring back all sorts of information about plants and animals and trees and stuff. In fact, they even sent some animals back. And for a time being, Jefferson had 2 bear cubs on the White House grounds that came back from the Lewis and Clark expedition. Lewis and Clark are also going to spur a lot more expeditions throughout the Rocky Mountains. And because of their exploration, we are going to be able to map out the entire western half of our country. But that's it. That's Jefferson's first term. When we get to the second one, it's not going to be as successful or as pretty. But we'll save that for next time. Thanks for listening. Hope you learned something. And if you didn't, rewind it, watch it again. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.